Hello, Dickinsonians. This is Annie Condas, Associate Dean for the Center for Advising Internships and Lifelong Career Development. I'm actually filling in today for Amity Fox, who couldn't be here, but we really have been working on this content now for about a year and really delving in as a staff into what this generation of students, so the students that are your interns and externs and entry-level employees want out of work and how to best work with them. So it was really important that we didn't skip this opportunity because she couldn't be here. But then I came on and that I was able to come on and was given the privilege of being able to deliver this information. So we're going to go ahead and get started. You can ask questions throughout the presentation, and at the end, I will get to any of your questions that you have. I will let you know that much of the information that was pulled together today was from our National Association of Colleges and Employers, which is our governing association that oversees kind of career development and employer relations for colleges and universities and employers that are hiring entry-level candidates. I also pulled a lot of resources from generational theorists, Strauss and Howe, and as well as just recent articles from Forbes magazine, as well as the Wall Street Journal. So those, on my final slide, I have all the resources that I used for this presentation. But I also want to note that I'm going to mix in some anecdotal evidence that we're seeing since we've been working with this population in our offices for the last few years, and what we're seeing that they want out of work. So it's a mixture of research as well as from what the college is seeing as we launch these students into the workforce. So what we're going to talk about today is about key traits of different generations in the workforce. This is one of the few times in our history that we've actually had 4 generations within the workforce at the numbers at which we've had them in the workforce. So it is important to understand how we're defining generations of people and how we're defining employees and what creates a generation. And I'm going to use generation theory to talk about that and recognize that something that's interesting about my own work and here at Dickinson is in my office we have 3 out of the 4 generations represented. You can include the 4 if you include our student staff. So I would include them and say we have all 4 generations working here. We're going to also talk about how to communicate with different generations. Specifically, we're going to focus on how to communicate with the new generation that's coming out. The Generation Z is what most people are calling them, and the ways in which they want to communicate. And I will tell you that when the research came out, and even what we're seeing, it was shocking to a lot of people. So you will be surprised with I think you'll be surprised, because I was surprised with the way in which this generation prefers to communicate. How to set objectives and give feedback for the greatest success for this generation, to retain them, but also to, turn them into solid employees, and how they prefer to gain feedback. Obviously everyone's individual, but kind of as a total and what they've experienced through their education system. And then developing interns into strong entry-level employees and moving from that intern where you're learning to actually contributing to the organization. So that's what we're going to cover today. And we're going to do it in about 20-25 minutes and then leave time for questions. Okay. So there is definitely challenges related to generational diversity, and from what we've read and what we understand, generational diversity should start to be included in ways in which we contribute to diversity, both on a college campus here as well in the workplace. I think we leave it out a lot when we think of diversity. I think it's easy to think of race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and attack those concerns or challenges, but to ignore generational diversity. And as for those that are, on YouTube or TikTok or any of the new media platforms, you'll notice that there is more and more discussion amongst younger generations about generational diversity. Of course, they don't use language such as generational diversity. They will create memes, entitled things like "Okay, Boomer," because there is a rub between the generations now that we've really not seen in a long, long time. Because of the way in which the generations are working together in the office as well as kind of out in the wider world. We're seeing a much larger older generation that is still occupying the workplace, and that is creating some challenges with younger people moving in and feeling connected, feeling part of the team, feeling like they have value. But it's also creating a situation in which the older staff might also feel like they're being pushed out or feel like they don't have as much value because they maybe aren't as up on the latest technology, or the market is changing at a rate that they are having a hard time keeping up with. What we're seeing in the trend of work is that work is moving at a much faster rate. If you look at career changes over the last 20 to 30 years, it used to be that a person on average about 30 years ago would change a career every 7 years. And that's moved down to 3 years, and it's projected that in the year 2030 that it's going to be at 1.5 years, that expected rate of moving to a different organization. And that contributes to the contract economy that we're starting to see in that. And there is a real fear there with different generations that might not operate that way or be able to be as agile in the workplace, and that can cause resentment. So obviously you have the younger staff challenging older staff looking down on younger staff. Those are typical things that you have seen, but it can get more complicated than that because of the way in which the economy in the world is changing. Also recruitment difficulties. I'll have recruiters talk with me about that they just need younger people, but and they want to recruit from the college population, but that the college, the students don't necessarily want to go work for those organizations because they don't have the big brand associated that is popular with that generation, or they have a staff that is just getting older, and while they need younger blood in their staff, younger talent wants to be working within a multi-generational staff and not necessarily a staff where everyone is over the age of 50. And so it's definitely a recruitment difficulty. If you don't have young people, how do you get young people? And so that's come up as why it really does need to be seen as a diversity issue. There's also technological challenges in here. I don't think any generation wants to be pegged as the generation that doesn't know how to use technology, but I also think that we've heard feedback from students that they don't want to be stuck doing social media for their companies all day long, because that's not going to grow their career just because they're younger. So I think there's challenges in that companies want to use Generation Z for their technology, being tech native, but you can't rely on that. And you have to expect that everyone within your organization is going to be comfortable with technology to a degree. So that's definitely come up as a generational diversity, that you can't assume that they want to do that because they're a certain age, and you can't assume that other generations don't want to do that because they're a certain age. And then lastly, there's of course work styles. Every generation has had somewhat of their own work style and what they want. Broadly speaking, different generations are categorized as wanting different things. You'll see that this idea that older generations sometimes want more traditional work hours, that they're more comfortable with that, whereas younger generations want more flexibility in that. And so how do you create company policies or corporate policies that align with the different types of ways people want to work? I know many of my friends, at some point they want pure flexibility, but as they grow in their careers and in their life, want to be able to leave their work at home and don't want to be expected to have to jump on their laptop at 8 p.m. Whereas there's other people that say, I want to be able to leave work at 3 so I can jump back on my laptop at 8 p.m. So that's a work style thing that can be generationally motivated. And so how do you adapt to that? We're also seeing with certain generations, they value different things. If you look at Generation X and Generation and millennials, and I'll define generations in a second. You're seeing Generation X really wanting higher pay right now, and that being their focus. Whereas millennials are saying opportunity growth and a chance to grow and be a decision maker in the company. So, motivation strategies can differ amongst different generations. So it's really important that you really do start to treat this as a diversity challenge and diversity issue within your organization. So before we get started too much delving into this, I do want to define generation. I use Neil Howe and William Strauss's definition. They are probably the leading generationalists, which mean that they've studied generations since the beginning of the start of kind of modern American life. And so they have defined the generations starting almost in, 1600s, in the founding of Jamestown to now. And what they've determined is that there generally is a 20-year span of different generations, and that they run through, that generations are somewhat cyclical, that we are more like a generation that came 2 generations before us than we are the generation that was right before us, because there is a cyclical nature of generations. So I'm going to out myself now as what my generation is, because it is hard to speak from a perspective and not let you know what my perspective is. So I will let you know that I am one of the oldest millennials. I'm a millennial, and I very much identify as a millennial, but I would say I'm an older millennial. So I am what's considered a cusp between Gen X. And I always think of my family. My parents are boomers, and I'm a millennial, and we are very different because it's very typical to reject the generation of your parents. So kind of moving on to defining the archetypes within a generation. So here are the 4 archetypes. You can read a little bit about those, but essentially there's a prophet, a hero, a nomad, and an architect that cycle through every 4 years. And typically this is based off economic cycles as well. You will see like with the prophet tends to be affected by what happened. Well, every generation is affected and formed by what happens in their childhood. So in their childhood, the prophets generally have a reconstruction type childhood, which is after a traumatic event in the culture, the reconstruction of that society is happening. So you see that with the baby boom, which is the generation that's currently in the workplace. It was after World War II. America was booming at the time. It was, that post-World War II boom of American life. You also see that with the missionary generation, which you probably have never heard of, but that was the generation that followed the reconstruction of the Civil War. And those 2 generations follow the same sort of track and path. Next, we have our hero generation, which will be our millennials, which are very similar to GIs. My grandparents were GIs, meaning that they were in childhood through kind of an awakening period. A lot of the GIs, for instance, were children during the 30s and 40s, and then eventually fought in World War II. And millennials are the same. So millennials are said to be more like the GIs than any other generation because of that. Nomads, they tend to be a little more, you've heard this before, Gen X being a little more lost. And so these tend to happen. These generations tend to be a little more overprotective, or these grow up, they tend to be more underprotective, whereas millennials were more overprotective, and they tend to be pragmatic in their midlife. And they usually are in childhood, during an awakening, a time of social ideals and spiritual agendas, when young people are passionately attacking the established institutional order. So during the 70s, you see the Gen X become, the 60s and 70s, that's when the Gen X were children. So it's really about what they see in childhood and not necessarily who they are as adults that form their generation norms. And then the artists, which are our Gen Zs and also our silent generation. This is kind of during a crisis. They became children during a crisis. So for Gen Z, the big thing for them was the financial crisis of 2008. When they were children, they saw that instability that was happening, which does form their social norms. And so if you look at this graph here, you will see the different generations that are in the workplace today. Baby boom, the Gen X, which Strauss and Howe call the 13th generation, the millennials, which that's what Strauss and Howe, but you've also heard them as Generation Y, and the homeland generation, which is Strauss and Howe's term, but that's Generation Z. And so you can see here, the baby boom are the prophets, they're idealists. The Generation X are reactive to that idealism. The millennials are very civic. And if you will notice, millennials and baby boomers are very, very different from each other. Even though they're our parents, I say our parents because I'm a millennial, they're our parents, but it does create conflict. What I like over here are these images of what different generations value. Baby boom tended to be very protective of their millennial children. They valued work and money and becoming financially stable, which is seen today, and they're definitely the wealthiest of the four generations. They have so much more earning potential as well as spending potential right now, and they're very individualistic in their approach. Versus jumping down to millennial generation, definitely a civic generation, really wants to contribute to the world more. They travel more. My parents will comment a lot, which are Karen and Tom Lodge, and I'll give them a shout out, but they will comment a lot about how my generation just doesn't work very hard. And I'll always comment back to them that, we value other things, in our life. And so there's definitely a culture clash there. I love my parents, but there's definitely a culture clash there because we just want different things out of work and different things out of life, which you see in the market. Generation X, the nomads, the reacting, that they, it's hard to pin them down. And I'm not gonna lie, there's not a lot of research out there on Gen X and what they're like in the workplace or as parents. But they can be seen as, also individuals. They are good workers. They like stability. They're moving in there, but it's definitely the millennials that are more shaking up the workplace than the Gen Xers. They're kind of fitting into both generations in there. And then we have our Gen Z, which is the population I'm currently working with as a college administrator. Obviously, they are more creative. Millennials are known as less creative of a generation, that it's really the Generation Z that they've grown up on being true digital natives, where they have been creating things on YouTube, they've been creating things on TikTok, they've been creating things on Instagram, whereas millennials are much more of digital adapters. They've learned it through their life, but they're not natives to it. I did not grow up I didn't get my first cell phone until I was in college. My sophomore year of college is when I got my first cell phone. So it wasn't a part of my life the way it is for the Gen Z. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what they are in a second. So moving into about Gen Z and what you can kind of expect from them. They are a very diverse, very, very, very diverse generation. People thought millennials were diverse. Gen Z is very diverse. And it's important that we adapt to that. We as a college are adapting to that. We're seeing our student population rise from students of color, and we're being intentional about that. We recognize that Dickinson shouldn't be just going after this 54% Caucasian, that we are really seeing growth in our student population in amongst Hispanics and amongst African Americans. So it's really important to recognize when you're recruiting how important it is to look at different racial makeups of your staff, because that is going to be important to them moving forward, that there's diversity, racial diversity amongst the workforce. You can see here that obviously we know that they have smartphones. We know that they like being on their smartphones. Most spend about 10 hours a day on their smartphones, but they do realize that it could hurt their interpersonal skills. But I'll explain in a second how this generation is different, because they've always had tech, They are very reliant on it for some things, and in other things, they don't want it. So we'll talk about that when we talk about mentorship. So 70% say salary is the most important factor of picking a career. Gone are the days where the students say, I'm willing to do an unpaid internship. Most students want a paid internship, they want a paid opportunity, and are prioritizing that higher than students in the millennial generation. Millennials came in saying, I want to do good for society, I want experience, I want to work for a nonprofit, I don't mind if they pay me or not. That could also be contributed to the fact that their parents were the baby boom generation, millennials, and for many of them, they did not necessarily need that extra money. Well, they probably needed it, but they didn't feel as much that they needed it. Whereas the Generation Z, being a more diverse generation, being a generation that values salary more than the millennials, you're not seeing as many students saying they're willing to take an unpaid internship. So as you start to formulate your internship program or consider that, recognize that you're not going to get the best applicants with an unpaid internship. So something else that's come up a lot is this, I'm sorry, I'm going back, is this idea of health insurance. Health insurance is more on students' mind now than it was in previous generations. I think there was an assumption before that health insurance would come with any entry-level job out of college, and that's just not the case anymore with the contract environment. It is a contract environment, and Generation Z recognizes it's something they might have to do, but they're not excited about it. So if your plan moving forward is to hire young people in a contract sort of way, you might, if you want the best people, you might be cognizant of the way in which that contract would work. Does that include health insurance? Is there stability? Is there a 9 to 5? More and more, this generation is going to want that stability versus the previous generation of millennials that was a little more open to kind of figuring out the best way. And it could be because they grew up in a much more prosperous time. Millennials did not grow up when the financial markets were crashing. And so they didn't crave that stability and work the way Generation Z does. So it's just something to consider. 38% think work-life balance is important. That is actually down from millennials. Millennials value their work-life balance. Generation Z is much more interested in having a flexible work environment in which they can work all the time, but also not work when they don't want to work. So they're willing to put in that time. It's not that they're not willing to put in 40, 50, 60 hours. It's just that they want to do it on their own terms. So that work-life balance is just not as important to them. So what you'll start to see is they're turning more into what the baby boom was, because they're rejecting that generation of Xers, which are most of their parents. And Generation X was much more about that 9 to 5, stable, and so you can see them going away from that. 76% say they're responsible for driving their own careers. More and more, this generation is seeing their role as being entrepreneurs, less likely to want to work in a team of people or have their accomplishments judged based on their team. They're much more individual than the millennials, and they really want to have their accomplishments be seen as such, and therefore are much more likely to become entrepreneurs. And they see themselves as being the main drivers in their career and not allowing others to dictate their rate of growth or how much money they're going to make. So that I see that as a really positive thing. And that's what the research shows. And we are seeing that in even the way the students do work. They are preferring to work solo versus work in teams, the way the millennial student body did. 23% expect texting to be important, which is funny because a lot of people will put judgments on the generation as being a very digital, and they're definitely addicted to their phones, but they do prefer, and this will come up in the next slide, they prefer face-to-face communication more than any other generation. They're very similar to GIs in this way, the GI generation, which is out of the workforce now, that they really want to do more things in person. They want to come to decisions in person because they don't read emails. They've learned to ignore a lot of what's going on in the digital world because they've had to. Everything has been pushed at them, from advertising to emails to websites. And so they've learned to tune a lot of the digital elements out, and therefore face-to-face becomes increasingly more important to them. 40% want daily interactions with their boss. So that's very high. And if they're not getting that in-person feedback, they see something as wrong there. So we're gonna talk a little bit about just basic changes that you'll see here. So you can see millennials, it used to be all about opportunities for growth. This generation was being promoted very quickly, and they were, and whether or not they got money with those promotions, they were given title changes. I have some friends that are VPs right now, or that were VPs in their 20s because that was just really important to them. Whereas Generation Z, it's all about the pay, and it's what you're going to pay them because they've grown up in a more financial, volatile world than what the millennials grew up with. Millennials here are very team-oriented. When I talked about before, I always say it might be time to put back up, take away the open concept work environments and to start putting back up those cubicles because they want to work independently. They want their own workspace. They don't want shared workspace as much. You can see here, millennials will become impatient if their career doesn't grow, whereas we're not seeing that much with this other generation. They're willing to stay in their same job and perform multiple roles. They're very good at multitasking. So it's really important that you tap into that and give them multiple projects at a time. As we talked about before, millennials are digital pioneers, whereas they are digital natives, so they can multitask with tech at a rate that we couldn't. But ultimately, they still prefer face-to-face discussion over millennials who really like to do things digitally. This is the most surprising thing that's come out of this, and we see it in our office. We are up, even though our student body is down this year, we have fewer students than we did a few years ago. Our numbers of appointments are actually up. And as much as we put online, the students still prefer that in-face counseling session or advising session. So that is something that we're seeing, and it could be because of the way in which students are at this age are more comfortable with therapists, they're more comfortable with counselors, that they really do like that face-to-face. Views about education. So you will see that millennials are starting to question education. Generation X was the big driver of the MBA programs, the more formal education after they've entered the workplace. We are seeing a downturn in that it's possible that incentives such as we'll pay for your master's degree or will allow you time to do that might not be as important to this generation as it was in the past, because they're becoming more skeptical of higher education as they move forward, which is not good news for us here at Dickinson, but it's just something to be aware of. Millennials are more optimistic, more positive, whereas they are just multitaskers. They have an entrepreneur mindset. So these would be great people. We're seeing the students want to go more into the sales careers than maybe what we saw with millennial generations, which can be a really good thing for our economy and our market. You also see here they are more creative, they're more like boomers, they're more sustainable, they also have more anxiety and depression. And so these are just things to know. How do they work together? So, or how would you work with them? I would really recommend that you communicate in person and not via email or text. It's likely to go over their head, or they're likely to ignore it with email or text. Create competition-based achievements. They like competition and they're very individualistic. So anything where you can put goals, sales goals that is individual in nature is going to be craved by this generation. Reward based on achievements, not based on group performance. So if an individual does something wonderful, it's really important that you recognize that person for their achievements. And even with your achievements, or with your rewards, you might want to consider a cash award or a salary bump rather than a gold sticker that the millennials would have preferred. Skip time-consuming unnecessary group work. They are multitaskers and they're super efficient. So they're going to get things done in record speed and don't see sitting around a team room shooting off ideas as effective use of their time. So, consider that when you're working with them. I put here, bring back the cubicles and lose the open concept. And this is hard because we fought so long to get rid of the cubicles, and now this idea that they want to work solo. But if you are going to have open concept, or you are going to do teams, we recommend keeping them small and keeping them tight-knit. This generation isn't as out there with new people as the millennials, and so just tight-knit small teams where they can really get to know each other and really trust each other is going to go a long way with this generation. How to embrace generational diversity. These are just some things that you may want to consider, such as reviewing your hiring practices to determine if you are doing something that maybe is hurting your generational diversity, such as recruiting from certain types of institutions, or recruiting from, saying you won't recruit entry-level candidates or only recruiting entry-level candidates. Make sure to review your job description and look for ageist language or things that indicate that you would not be interested in certain demographics of people, especially when it comes to skills that they would need. I see more and more people are saying must have 5 years, Java. And then they're saying, oh yeah, but we would love to have Generation Z. We want their creativity. Well, there's no way they're going to have 5 years of Java if they don't, coming right out of college. So just being open to that. Don't let age be a barrier. Don't consider giving people promotions based on age is what I'm saying there. So there used to be this idea that, you couldn't be a marketing director until you were in your 40s, or you couldn't, because that's going to be one of the fastest things to get Gen Z out. They want to be recognized for their accomplishments, and they want to be at the level on which their accomplishments are obtained. So not promoting them because they're too young is something you don't want to do. You want to promote competence and not just experience, so that you are promoting them through and giving them the salaries that they deserve. Don't make age-based assumptions such as this is the young person, we'll put them on the Facebook account or the Instagram account, but also don't assume that older generations couldn't do those things or that they wouldn't be good at them. Because I think this generation will get very tired always being the go-to person for that technology, especially when it's not their job to be that person. And it can become exhausting. I'm the youngest person in my office, so there's a running joke with some of my colleagues that the heads will turn and look at me whenever there's an issue with tech, and I'll be like, oh, hold on, let me call my husband who works in IT. So I think that you just have to be aware of that. Consider providing more job security for the younger generation and not less job security. That is something they're going to be attracted to, is more job security, rather than going with the trends of the market, which is right now the trends tend to be less job security. We tend to give more job security to older employees, such as the boomers and the Xers, and we're giving less job security for the millennials and the Gen Z. So it's my plea to say that they want this, they crave this, and you're going to lose really solid employees if you're not willing to, or if you're just willing to keep them on a contract basis. Provide authentic mentoring programs. They want face-to-face communication, but they want it to be authentic. They don't want it to just be, fill out a performance evaluation or something online, meet once a year. That truly they want something that is going to be impactful, almost similar to the way that you would have somewhat of like a pastoral care or therapy session. Not that extreme, but something more in line with that is going to help. So that was my last slide. I threw up the resources that I used to develop this presentation, as well as anecdotal evidence from my work with students over the past 5 years. I could talk about this topic for hours, and I had to cram it into I even went over into a 30-minute presentation. So there's still research being done, and none of it is perfect. These are theories, and so I hope you can use some of this content in, as you manage younger people, as you develop your recruitment strategies and programs, and as you take on interns and externs. I hope this was useful to you. I'm going to answer any questions. So if you have any, I'll stay on the line for about 5 minutes, but thank you for tuning in. This is our last professional development webinar for the semester, since we still work in semesters here at the college. We will come back in January with talking with one of our alumni about managing an international career and how to take your career international, if that's something you're interested in. All right, so I'm gonna open it up for questions now. If anyone has one, please feel free to shoot one across. I don't see any questions coming through. So if I'm cutting this too early and you have a question, feel free to email me. It's Annie Condas, which is KONDASA @dickinson.edu. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about this with any of you further. So have a wonderful end to your year, and have a good holiday season. And feel free to connect with us in any way that you see fit. All right, thank you.